and welcome to our event today. I'm Kath Feely and welcome to the Museum of Me, or actually, hopefully, as we're going to be making our own museums in this event, the Museum of You too. In a few minutes' time, we'll be talking to artist Liz Welby about how we can make our own mini museums. And later in the event, we'll also be talking to Claire Mosley from the Derbyshire Record Office, who is going to be taking us through how we can preserve our treasures that we've perhaps collected over the last couple of months as mementos of 2020. Before we start, however, I just wanted to say that this event is part of the Being Human Festival, and the Being Human Festival is the UK's only national festival of the humanities. It's taking place mainly online in the year that we're in this year, and you can find out more about over 200 events that have taken place or are taking place if you go to their website, which is www.beinghumanfestival.org. We also just like to thank them for sponsoring these events, making them happen. So Being Human is run from the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of London and is supported by the British Academy and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So thank you very much for them for allowing these events to take place. Here at the University of Derby, we've had a whole programme of events around our partnerships with archives and libraries and museums to think about how we can use objects from those collections to reimagine Derby's and Derbyshire's role in the world, in the wider world. And so before we start making our own museums today, inspired by the Derbyshire Record Office, I'm really happy to have Dr. Ruth Larson from the University of Derby, who is going to talk to us a little bit about a particular mini museum in their collection, which was the Museum of Lady Jane Franklin. So really great to have you here with us today, Ruth. Could you tell us a little bit about Lady Jane Franklin and the mini museum that we can find in the Derbyshire Record Office?
Of course I can, and thank you very much for inviting me here this afternoon. So Lady Jane Franklin was born Jane Griffin. She grew up here in Britain, but she spent a good part of her youth travelling around Europe. This is because her father was a silk merchant, and so she got to go on overseas trips with him. So she was a woman who was very much interested in travel. She was also a woman, unlike many other women in the 19th century, who was interested in science. And she attended lectures in the Royal Society, so she was very knowledgeable about scientific ideas. But it was really once she married her husband, John Franklin, the great explorer, where she got more and more opportunities to explore the wider world. Now, Sir John Franklin, of course, is very famous because he is a great explorer of the 19th century. He travelled around the Arctics in particular, and it was the Arctics which led to his death when he was trying to find a route through the Northern Passage. So this is where he became really important. And what we've been inspired by today is a collection of objects that are part of the Derbyshire Record Office collection as part of the archives that they have for the Gell family. Sir John's eldest daughter, Eleanor, married into the Gell family of Hopton Hall, and the objects that her family had have now formed part of the Derbyshire Record Office. And within those objects, that collection was a whole collection of objects which you can see now on the screen. And within these objects, there's a whole host of fantastic things about places that you went to see.
So can you tell us a little bit more about these objects and what they tell us about Lady Jane's travels? Absolutely.
So one of the really interesting objects that we can see is this object, which is some mummy cloth from Thebes. And she picked this up while she was travelling around the Mediterranean, while her husband was navigating HMS Rainbow, also within the Mediterranean. So she had a connection to her husband on board the ship, but she was travelling around various places, including Egypt. This was part of the time period where there's great Egyptomania amongst aristocrats and other middle-class women within Britain and also in France. And so they collected objects like this. And you can see on the writing of it that she's laid it all out like a museum. It tells us precisely where it is, this really ancient thing. And this is not the only one. There's another one that's also in the collections as well. And you can see that this is degrading a little bit, showing its real age. But this was part of a number of things that she had on show, her souvenirs of her travels.
So where else did Lady Jane travel, Ruth? And what other sort of parts of the world can we see in this collection?
Well, like many other Victorian women, she was really interested in biblical history. So this led to her going to Mount Sinai. And one of the things that she collected in that was a nut from the gardens of St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai. And so she's collecting objects from the natural world, just like we do when we go on our walks, and they form as mementos of our memories and things that we are doing. She not only has nuts which are ancient, like this one here, but also more recent things, or recent to her, are some acorns as well that she collected. Because when she was in Tasmania, her and her husband put some acorn trees in the garden, and this is one of the acorns that grew on one of those trees. It has clearly been sent back to her at a later point. So in her collection, she's got all of these little nuts and acorns, which you can see. And again, she was laying them out as part of her travels, and they form a really nice collection of objects in her mini museum.
I believe she also went to Australia, Ruth. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when she was in Tasmania with her husband, this was because she was there in her role as a wife of the governor of Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land, as it was in that time period. So she settled there, and they set up a school and a museum in Houston, but also travelled around. She, in fact, travelled around New Zealand. And so this is one of the very many travels that she had, which has led to her being described as one of the most travelled women in the world during the long 19th century.
And so you said that Franklin was governor of Van Diemen's Land. Of course, that was very much where convicts were sent. Is there anything in the collection that relates to convicts?
Yes, there is. There's this really unusual object, which is a little heart cut out, and the label of it says that it was worn by a Tasmanian prisoner's boy. And so this is an interesting object. We don't know why she has this, how she got it from the prisoner, or the prisoner's boy, and it seems to be some type of love token. So clearly this had some affection or memory for her as that role as a governor's wife, but there seems to be something slightly unethical about the fact that we have it here today.
Yep, so are there any personal items that we can see in this collection? Because, you know, it's not just about travels, or anything that's very much personal to Jane.
Well, of course, if we have a museum of ourselves, one of the things that we want to put in is family objects and things that remind us of ordinary people and the people that are important to us in our lives. And while Franklin and his wife were in Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, they adopted a young Aboriginal girl. It was during his time within Van Diemen's Land that most of the Aboriginal families were removed from the main island and put into a colony, but a couple of the children stayed behind in the orphanage school as well, and one of them is a young girl called Mary. Jane and her husband adopted her and brought them up and brought her into the household, renamed her Mathena as part of that process. And she was educated by their stepdaughter, Franklin's daughter by his first wife, and they had a very close relationship. And in one of the letters where Ellen is describing teaching her daughter, she's also talking about the fact that Mathena had a little doll with a petticoat, and that appears to be what this doll is. And this doll is really unusual, because if you look at it in more detail, you can see that it's actually quite heavily worn, but it's also, as well, it's wearing a red petticoat, as was suggested. And we don't know much about Mathena, but there's a couple of surviving letters that point to this, also point to this being part of her collection. So she wrote a letter where she talks about the fact that she's got sore feet because she's wearing shoes, which shows the way in which she was now living a very different life. Now she was within a Western style family as opposed to the family that she'd grown up with previously. But also both in that letter and a painting of her, she describes wearing a red dress. And so the red that you can see on the petticoat here suggests that there's got some type of memory. Unfortunately, when the Franklins left Tasmania, they left her behind. The doctors suggested that she wouldn't be able to cope with British weather, and they thought that was reason enough to leave her behind. She stayed at the orphanage and then eventually settled back within the other Aboriginal communities, but sadly she died. And that tells us a little bit about the complex stories behind these objects, but also as well how very badly treated many of those communities were during this period of colonisation.
So how unusual is Lady Jane, Ruth, in having a collection like this, or do we see lots of little mini museums like this?
We do see lots of other examples like this. I mean, Lady Jane's unusual because it's from very much all around the world. She was this great traveller. She liked taking her own bed with her, which was made out of lead so that it wouldn't allow any fleas to bite her as well. But this collection is typical of a lot that aristocratic women had. So also here within Derbyshire, Georgiana, the 5th Duchess of Devonshire, who's of course connected to Chatsworth Hall, collected a whole series of stones as part of geological interests that she developed, and they're still on show at Chatsworth. And there's other women as well, including the Duchess of Portland, who's got a connection to Welbeck Abbey in Nottinghamshire. She was very famous for the great collection of objects that she had. But what we're really seeing when women are doing this is that they're collecting objects as conversation pieces for when guests come, so that they can talk about the things that are important to them, the travels that they've been on, and as a form of entertainment, as well as them working as a repository of memories. And that's what's really fascinating about these museums like this of Lady Jane, is that they tell us about them and their lives and what they found interesting, but also the things that they wanted to keep and to preserve.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ruth, for that fantastic and really interesting introduction to Lady Jane's Museum. In the last couple of months, we haven't been travelling very much, and perhaps some of the things that we've been collecting hopefully have less of an ethical issue than some of the things that Lady Jane collected. But I think we do want to tell our stories, and we do want to think about mementos and remembering this time. And I'm sure that a lot of people have been collecting things over the past 6 or however many months we've been in this now. And particularly, I think as people have been out on their sort of nature walks, they may have collected things like acorns and so forth, perhaps not labelling in the same way as Lady Jane did, but certainly thinking about how they can not only house these things and keep them, but also conserve them for memories to come. So I'm really delighted then that the artist Liz Welby has actually sort of come up with a way for us to think about how we might house our own mini museums. So Liz is going to take us through the process of making your own treasure houses in the next few minutes. Hopefully, if you signed up to this event, you should have been sent a template where you can actually start going along with us and making your treasure houses alongside Liz as she works. Also, we'd love for you to share your treasure houses. So if you'd like to tag us on social media, if you use the hashtag BeingHuman2020 on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, it'd be really good for us to see what you've been collecting and how you've been using Liz's templates to make your own houses. So I'm going to pass over now to Liz Welby, who's going to take us through the process of making our own museum. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Liz Welby, artist, teacher and maker, and today I'm going to show you how to make treasure houses and hanging tokens. So if you have all your materials and equipment ready, we can get started. So I shall see you on the cutting mat shortly. Our first make today is a treasure house, so we can keep your treasures safely hidden, and I think they also make really nice decorative objects. Now, the materials you'll need to have, greetings cards are really useful. You might have some different colours of A4 card, or you could also have some cereal packets. I'm going to work on some A4 card, and I've got my templates, so I'm going to place the little tray and the house template on here, and I'm just going to match them up with the edges and then trace around to begin with. Once they're in place, you can then have a look at your templates and then see where you need to just mark on the different folds and also where the tabs are going to be. And you'll also need to do that on your tray as well. Now, when it comes to cutting out, you can either use scissors, but I prefer a craft knife. Just make sure you're working on a nice surface, such as a mat or a magazine or a newspaper, and try and make sure you're focusing on the task and not having a conversation. Okay, so in true Blue Peter fashion, I've got a couple that I've made earlier. So I've then used a ruler and I've folded each time that I need to. So you're going to get nice crisp folds, and that's going to be really useful when you're putting everything together. Okay, so those are now ready, and shortly I can get on and put some tape to them to join them. So for the roof, I've chosen to use something patterned because I think that's going to have a really nice feel to it. So I'm just going to line that up, choose a section that I particularly want, and then because it's a pattern, I'm going to use a biro this time so I can really see, but when I come to cutting out. Again, I'll mark on where the folds will be. I'll do that in pencil so it's a little bit lighter. And I've also got a centerpiece as well for where the roof folds. So I shall quickly cut this out. Doesn't matter if you're a little bit wobbly on the lines, it'll all be hidden and disguised. So a couple little bit more pieces on the side. Back to the ruler, so I'm going to fold over, and then I'll fold halfway for the point on the roof. So we now have the different elements in place, and I'm onto some double-sided tape. If you haven't got double-sided tape, you can use Pritt stick, that will be fine. And I'm going to place this on all of the areas where there are tabs. Which takes a little bit of time. just onto the final piece. And I'm just trimming off any of the little pieces that are overhanging. Okay, now doors and windows. So I've gone for quite a traditional feel with a central front door and the windows arranged around. Here you can put a little bit of your own personality into it and see what you fancy. I think I'm going to go for a nice colourful front door. So I'll just take a small piece from the corner and then I can trim that down. That looks okay, and then I can work on the windows. I think here I'm going to use the text and cut myself some strips which I can then cut to size. So I'm going to use just a little bit of glue and start with the front door. So I know that that is more or less central. So we're here so far. I think I'll put a couple more windows on the ends. Okay, so we're all in place. I'm going to start putting the building together. So peel the tape off and carefully join that to the opposite side. Give that a little bit of a shape. Onto the slightly trickier bit for the roof. So I'll try and get that central and then just press the tape through the back and then slide the front through. So a little bit of adjustment. So now I have my treasure house, and then onto the little tray which will be placed inside it and will contain all the little treasures. So I'm just easing these into place, making sure they're nice and secure. You can use a Pritt stick type of glue if that's what you have. They just take a little bit longer to stick, so you might want to hold those together just for a few seconds to encourage the glue to hold. So that's my little box. And then we have our treasure houses complete. Okay, so we're going to move on to hanging tokens now. So sort of little decorative objects. So sort of simple shapes. It all works to do with symmetry. And a couple of examples, a larger one and a smaller one. The larger one just simply doesn't have enough pieces in it, whereas the smaller one is much more sort of compact and has a much more pleasing form, I think. So we're going to get started. Okay, all recycling and using upcycled materials. So have a look at some books around home. The ones to use are the perhaps older and definitely hardback, because it's a nicer quality paper. But the older the book, the better. I think this is probably one from the 40s or 50s, and it's got a really nice thick paper to it. I'm going to use Children's Annual, and my first job is to choose 4 pages, and I'm just going to rip those out. Now, templates as well. So on the sheets that you should have downloaded, you have some templates. Now I've cut one out and I have just the half, and I've got a small piece of cardboard folded down the centre. I'm just going to place this carefully onto the edge, and then using scissors I'm going to cut out this first template. Now I'm going to open that out and see if I like the look of it. If I'm not too happy with anything, it's not quite got a point to the base, so I can recut. But it's important that you do all the adjustments when it's folded, so you're cutting through the card, 2 sheets of card or 2 layers of card at the same time. So, okay, I'm happy with that. Now for speed, I've already drawn out some of the hearts. All I'm going to do now is just add a couple more to the top. Because I'm working on something that's got pattern and colour, I'm using a biro instead of a pencil, because you're just really not going to see it. It's not going to stand out quite sufficiently. So I'm just holding it in place and drawing it round. Okay, so I've got 8 on here, so when I cut them out I'm going to have 32 pieces, because that's approximately what we need for this piece. So I begin by just sort of rough cutting them into little sections, and then making sure that you're holding them really firmly together and make sure they're sort of knocked into place. Use your finger and thumb to hold them as you carefully cut to the line. And it isn't something to rush. Take this nice and steadily, otherwise you end up with some really rough shapes. So if you can cut carefully to your line, you'll get a good result. And I'll just do a second one, holding it nice and firmly together so nothing's sliding around. If you have paper which is a bit thin or shiny, it can move around at this point. That's why something from a hardback book is much better, because it's a thicker quality and less likely to move. Okay, so you'll need to get all of those finished. But again, I've done a little bit of preparation. Okay, so next job is to fold them. I tend to do this all the same way, making sure you get a nice firm fold on all of them. So I start at one side and then work round from there. And I'm afraid there's no shortcuts on this. You can't do 2 or 3 together. They need to be folded individually so that you get a really nice, firm, crisp, sharp edge to them. Right, on to the gluing. It is a simple process and it's quite repetitive, but it gets you the results. So I've just folded again, I'm gluing to the halfway, and I'm just gluing around the edge. And you don't need to worry about the centre. I'm going to get one of my folded pieces, place it on top, and try and line it up as closely as I possibly can, and just press it down firmly. Now once that's in place, I will then put another one exactly on top, and just continue. I put sort of 3 or 4 together to begin with on this right hand side, And then just have a little look. You can peel that back. If you've got too much glue on them, you can just wipe it off on the edges and making sure that they are starting to fit together nicely. I'm going to swap sides now. And with the same process, just build up again. And again, I'm going to lift it up and just open them out. Make sure there's nothing sticking together. And it just kind of encourages you as well, because you think you're making good progress. Okay, now it is important that every time that you finish sort of spacing them out and checking them, that you go back to that same position and place every time. So it's almost you're going to try and find like a spine in the centre, and then you can put them flat again. And continue. Now I have one that's a little bit further along, and I'm just going to put a couple more to it. And then I should be ready to pop a hanger in. So it's starting to look a lot fuller, getting a really nice shape to it. Okay, so double-sided tape. So I want a piece that's slightly shorter, which goes going to go from the top almost to the bottom. And that's a little bit long, so I'll just trim a bit more off. And really press that down. And then carefully as you can, try and peel that back. This might take a little while. And then you can peel that away like so. And then threads. I tend to use sort of butcher's twine and things like this, or some a little bit of string is fine. If you've got ribbons, that will be okay. It's up to you with what you have. I think I'm going to use a little bit of black. I'm going to fold that in half so I can work out how long the hanger is going to be. And at the bottom I'll put the end pieces, the two open bits, and then arrange that up the centre. Then I'll fold up flat, and then on one side I'll put my last amount of glue, and this time I'll cover the whole section, especially the centre. And then I will join the two remaining pieces together, like so. And just very carefully now. Got my hanger in there, so that's going to stay put. It's looking a little battered at the moment, so spend a little bit of time opening them out, just spacing. Making sure there's nothing that's stuck together that shouldn't be. And then you're going to have your own hanging token.
Well, thank you, Liz, for that really interesting and fascinating demonstration of how we can make our own museums. And hopefully you're very busy making your own. And as I said before, we'd love to see any of your treasure houses. So please do hashtag beinghuman2020 on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, and we'd love to see what you've been making. Now we're really happy to be joined by Claire Mosley from the Derbyshire Record Office, who is going to take us through not only how we can preserve these memories now, but for years to come, hopefully. So I'm passing over now to Claire, who is going to take us through how to conserve these wonderful objects that we've collected.
Hi, my name is Claire. I'm one of the archive conservators at Derbyshire Record Office. We look after archive materials, so we've got letters, diaries and books in our collections that have survived for hundreds of years. Now, most of these items are made from paper or parchment, and this is organic material. It's originally from the natural. Hey, Mummy. Just bear with me 1 second.
This is what happens when you're making museums, you see. You have people hopefully helping you doing it. So it's really great to see that we can get children involved in this as well. This is a family activity. Great to have you back, Claire. Okay. So you were telling us about the archives and how you have all of these different paper things that you have to look at. So can you tell us a little bit about how you conserve that in the record office?
Yeah, so these items are made from, that we have in the archive, are made from paper or parchment. So this is organic material. It's originally from the natural world. So a bit like some of the items that you might have in your little mini museums that you've been creating. You might also have some precious photographs or letters or drawings at home that might be particularly special, and you want to try and keep those safe for the future as well. So I'm just going to try and give you a few tips on how to do this. Now, obviously, organic material does naturally deteriorate slowly over time, but there are a few basic things you can do to slow down this process and to limit any damage, and we call this preservation. That's what we call it as archive conservators. So to preserve your treasures, the main thing to think about is the environment they're kept in. So for us, that's mainly the conditions in our storage area. So this is where our treasures live most of the time. We have to make sure the conditions are just right for our archives to live in. Now, for archives, the #1 potential issue is water. We don't want things to get wet, as that's not good for them at all. And if it's damp, then mould will grow, and this will also cause damage to objects and paper and whatever we've got to look after. So in our stores, we keep a close eye on the moisture levels in the air. We have to use dehumidifiers if they get too high, and we're very concerned about making sure that the conditions are absolutely right. We also think about the temperature of the room that they're stored in, because a combination of high temperatures and high humidity, that's not good either. It can encourage mould to grow, and also things like insects to breed. So some insects might like to have a little nibble of some of your precious objects, particularly if they're made from organic material, could soon become their food. Heat and humidity also speeds up the degradation of material. So the two things combined, not very good. So that's what we worry about at the Record Office. Something else that can be really damaging to historic items, and something we worry about a lot with archives, particularly because they're very vulnerable to that, is light. So light is all around us. It can be very damaging to all organic material, including paper, textiles, leather and photographs. Now, every time light hits the surface of an object, it causes irreversible chemical changes and damage. You can see examples of this everywhere. Anything that's exposed to a lot of UV light from sunlight can fade quickly. Particularly things like colour photographs, they're particularly vulnerable, or textiles. If they get a lot of light exposure, then they can fade over time, and it's really not good for them. So at home, you probably won't be able to monitor any of this in the same way we do, because we obviously have lots of equipment that we use to do that. But a bit of thought about where you store things and what you store them in may play a part. So basically, you need to think that you want to store your precious objects anywhere which is cool and dry, out of light, away from a heat or water source. So pipes and radiators and things like that to think about. So it may simply be a case of moving a box away from a radiator, or if you've got things in a damp shed or a damp garage, move them into the house. Maybe if you've got boxes of things in a warm attic, you might want to bring them down and put them into a cooler spare bedroom or a room which isn't used a lot. If you're not sure about moisture levels in a storage area, it might be a good idea to occasionally check the condition of any precious items that you might have. So if you've got a box with things in, occasionally open it up and have a look. If you think it might be damp in a room, that box might suddenly become a little microclimate for mold to grow. So just keep a little eye on your things, and it might just save them in the future. Now, when it comes to light, what you can do really simply is just move things out of light or away from light. So you've got a precious photograph in a frame on a wall next to a bright window, that's going to get lots of sunlight hitting it over time, and that will fade eventually. If you move that to a darker area of the house, you're going to limit that light damage. Or better still, you could take the original out of the frame, make a copy, put the copy in a frame, and then put that back on the wall, keep the original somewhere safe and out of light. And that's a really good way of preserving your precious photographs. Another really basic thing would be to keep things clean and dust free. Dust and dirt can be abrasive to surfaces and cause damage. It might be an obvious one, but clean hands at the moment, this is really important. We're all thinking about clean hands, but we advocate this anyway for handling historic material. Dirt and oil on your hands can cause damage too. It can harm the surfaces, particularly photographs or anything that's got a vulnerable surface. So you could also wear something like nitrile gloves if you want to be extra careful. And at our archive, one of our rules in our storage areas and in search room is that we don't eat or drink near any of the original material, because sticky fingers aren't good, and crumbs from food also could attract insects, so not good either. So if you wanted to give your objects a little clean to remove any dirt or dust, that might be a good idea, because that might help them to be preserved. So we use sort of natural bristle brushes like this. I've got a little conker here that I might have picked up on a nature walk, and you could just give them a little brush the dirt off. So if you probably won't have anything professional at home like our archive brushes, these sort of natural hair brushes, but you could use something like a clean makeup brush or a very soft natural bristle brush. We even use occasionally toothbrushes to just clean things very gently. So that's something that you can do. So keeping them clean, really important, but a really basic thing would be to use packaging to keep your bits and bobs safe. Packaging is really important for us at archives. It gives an extra layer of protection for precious things. At the record office, all our archive material is packaged before it goes onto a shelf, and it's a great way of preventing things like water or light or dirt or even insects from getting into your treasures and penetrating through to the original thing. So in our archive, we look after Lady Jane's Museum, and this is kept in a box like this. I think this might be a little bit similar to some of the things that you've been making, these little trays, which we use for the objects in Lady Jane's Museum. So we might put a little object into a little acid-free box like this and then put it into a tray. So it's just sort of thinking about where they're stored. And these boxes, obviously, because these are from the archive, these are all acid-free and archival quality. And for our documents or photographs, we also use special archival quality sleeves and folders. And we also make little bespoke boxes for things which we tie up with unbleached cotton tape. So that's something that we use at the archive. So at home, your packaging could simply be putting things into a box. At the record office, we have archival quality storage boxes like this on our shelves. So those are our nice big boxes, but yours at home could simply be just a shoe box or any sort of storage box. It's just that extra layer of protection to stop things from coming in. And you don't want, if anything accidentally became wet, then you've just got a bit more time to save those objects as well. We also use acid-free tissue paper to wrap items in. So your little nuts, you could just wrap those up into acid-free tissue paper before you put it into your box, or you could line your box with a little bit of felt, like a little bit of natural felt. The most thing to think about with this is that the less chemicals there are in these materials, is best. So you don't want anything coloured. You don't want to risk any colour leaching onto objects if it did become wet. So it's just a case of thinking about the materials that you're using to store these things in. You could even perhaps make a little bag out of something like unbleached cotton or calico. This is some very natural sort of organic material that we could use to make a little bag to put your items in. So in summary, to keep your treasures safe, store somewhere cool and dry, well away from heat or water, out of the way of a light source, and package with natural materials if you can. And that's it really. So back to Kath to finish today's session.
Thank you very much for that, Claire. A really interesting way into thinking about how the Record Office look after Lady Jane's museum, as well as thinking about how we can look after our own that we've made. That sort of brings today's event to a close. I'd just like to thank again Dr. Ruth Larson for introducing us to Lady Jane Franklin's museum, and Liz Welby for helping us make our museums, and Claire Mosley for taking us through the conservation process. Please do share your treasure houses with us. We'd love to see what you have made and what you have collected over these past few months as mementos of this very strange year. And I'd just like to thank you for joining us and for hopefully getting involved in making these things. This is our final Being Human event here at the University of Derby. We've had a wonderful 10 days in thinking about how we can use the very rich collections that we have on our doorstep to tell interesting stories about Derby's role in the wider world. And I'd just like to thank, very briefly, I'd like to thank particularly all the colleagues who have contributed to all of these different events and all the people that have come to them. But I'd also like to give a special shout out to the students who are in the studio today from, let me get this right, Live Sound and Live Event Technologies, who have actually made all of these events happen. And I'd like to particularly thank Christopher West, who has been the project manager for these live streams, for getting all of this together. So I'd like to thank you very much for all you've been doing to get these events out to our audience. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy carrying on making some of the things that we've been talking about today, and that you perhaps think a little bit differently about Derby and Derby's collections. Thank you very much indeed.